So to get into this complex area, let's start with a simple story. And this is a story about my teenage experience as a boyfriend to my girlfriend Kate. And we had been going out for 2 or 3 years. In fact, it was going really well. I'd even gone to university, and she was a little bit younger, so she was still back doing her A-levels. And at Valentine's Day, I got this enormous card full of affirmation, and everything was great. I went home at Easter to see my family and, of course, to see her. And I meet her after work. She works in a coffee shop, but she's a bit quiet. And we go for our usual walk around a lake. And this is why you can see a bench, because we arrive at a bench and she, after a very sort of stunted section of conversation where things are almost awkward, I just think she's not well or something. She says that she wants to stop. So I, of course, say that that's not a problem at all. And there's a bench just nearby. So we go and sit down on the bench together. And she insists, no, I really think we should stop. And of course, I now understand that she really doesn't feel well, so maybe she wants to stay longer on the bench and really take her time. Now, it must have been the emotions of the situation. You know, after 3 years of teenage romance, these things are not easy to say, but you can only really repeat the same phrase, I think we should stop. So I insist that, well, this bench is actually halfway around the lake, and if we carried on, it's almost like the same as just going back the other way, but, you know, I don't mind either way. And now she gets really quite emotional, and she repeats the same phrase with tears, and so my brain has to jump into a different gear now and try and interpret this data from a different mindset, from a different framework. And a little thought comes into my head that, well, she does do drama as an A-level. Maybe this is some sort of like performance, as if she is dumping me. And of course, it's a very convincing performance. So I start laughing, because nowhere in my paradigm, nowhere in my worldview is it possible that the relationship is ending on this bench. And of course, the more that I laugh, the more that she cries, and it reaches this sort of transcendently horrible moment where something else has to break. And of course, in the end, I understood what she was saying, and I walked alone away from the bench, and it took me some time to recover. Now, that story from many years ago is in a way an illustration of how the climate crisis appears to us in terms of education, in that there's a really profoundly uncomfortable truth out there about the world and about this scientific reality, and we can't quite look at it. We can't bring ourselves to really directly confront this, that there are tipping points in very close proximity, in different planetary boundaries, but in a way what we're doing is good. You know, we do all sorts of good things in education. So do we really have to deal with this? Do we really have to change everything to accommodate this fact? And there's part of us that just is not willing to acknowledge that this cannot just be treated as a marginal concern or a passing interest for some virtuous people who are, you know, enjoy eating bio apples and cycling their bikes and so on. You know, this is something of such significance that it changes everything. So there's often tensions between the details of what we think, what we believe, what we know, and the framework which holds all of those facts and figures and so on together. So in the case of Kate, that was just a terrible romantic tragedy for me. And as a less personal example, let's zoom back in time to the 1700s, because there was an Oxford professor called Robert Plot, Dr. Robert Plot, or actually he was actually known as the learned Dr. Plot. And he was out fairly regularly digging around in his Oxfordshire, where he lived. And he was the author of a book called The Natural History of Oxfordshire. And this was published in 1677. Now here's an interesting detail from what he wrote, because he describes the discovery of a massive bone that he's just dug up. And it was in a quarry. And when he finds this huge bone, which is actually in the shape of a thigh bone, he writes this. He says that I have dug out of a quarry in the parish of Cornwall something that has exactly the figure of the lower part of a thigh bone of a man, or at least some other animal. Now, what Dr. Plot has got in his hands is actually a bone from a megalosaurus. And he was living 200 years before we really got to understand the notion of deep time. So in his hand he has this bone, but there's no way that in his universe, in his worldview, that this bone could be anything other than human. Well, he does actually speculate that it could be an imported elephant bone from Rome, but he dismisses that and just kind of settles on this enormous human idea. Now, of course, we now know through that the Earth is not just 5,000 years old, as they thought then, that it's 4.6 billion years old, and in fact, dinosaurs existed. But that's not something that he was capable of thinking. So it's a little bit like that with environmental education, in that the actual truth of what we have to bring to the students is going to crack some basic assumptions about how we see the world. Okay, now we're not talking about dinosaurs and things like that, but we're talking about the need to think about our economy and our culture and our society in a way which is really radically different. And so concepts like, for example, growth, when we say the word growth, we can't mean it in the usual sense. So just like when our professor is holding a bone and he thinks it's human, he needs to see that that notion of a bone has to be completely flipped. Another difficult assumption that we have about environmental action or environmental policies or environmental investments is that they are generally expensive. Now, the presupposition there is that the economy will carry on whatever, and these marginal environmental factors, we will be able to accommodate them somehow in some clever Excel sheet of accounting, or we could get around it by doing things a bit later, etc. Now, the truth is that you simply cannot transgress these planetary boundaries, and the action can't be delayed further than now. The amount of infrastructure that needs to be built in order to make any attempt at staying below 2 degrees possible, those things have to start happening right now. And to pretend that this is some sort of payoff between jobs and a wider economy and so on, well, in the rather cliched idea, it's like shuffling the chairs around on the deck of the Titanic. And to make this false assumption clearer, we could just take the story of a man called Aaron Ralston. So you can see his face here. He fell down a crevice out when he was out walking on his own, and when he fell, unfortunately, a rock fell with him and trapped him down inside this crevasse. And he had nothing on him. He didn't have a phone. He just had a bit of water, some burritos, and a penknife. And he realized very quickly that he was not going to get out of here. No matter how hard he tried, he could not move his arm and get it unstuck from the rock. After a few days, he decided that he needed to start writing some final messages to his family with the penknife, so he started scratching on the wall. And then by the 4th, 5th day, he becomes a little bit delirious. He's drunk his water, he's eaten his burritos, and at the same time he realizes that his arm is starting to go a little bit manky. It's starting to get a little bit soft. And he has this thought that, well, if he uses his knife and if he cuts off his arm, he could survive. But of course that means that he's going to have to cut his own arm off with a blunt penknife. But he makes the decision to do it because it's better to survive without a bit of an arm than to die trapped by that rock. Now, when we talk about green investments, apart from the fact that these are regenerative, they create jobs, they lead to a healthier environment overall, which has got far less pollution, etc., even if that wasn't the case, that it had this positive side effect, we have to do it anyway, otherwise there will be no economy. And a few humans may be able to survive in a 4-degree world, but it's almost certain that there won't be human civilization. So these are the kinds of basic grammatical assumptions, these are like the basic groundwork principles of our thinking, which are not evident when you listen to the media talk about climate change. And to bring those things to the surface, this problem framing is a really important task for us as educators with our children.